Day, everybody. Isn't this awesome? Woohoo! It's so good to see so many faces in the office, getting all of our cross-team interactions back again in live action for those of us in Sydney office, but also the Gold Coast office too. So hope you're all feeling inspired and motivated today. It's really, really cool. But we have a very special event on now, which I'm very excited about. Shara is somebody I met, I think some years ago, actually, but I have seen Shara talk a few times before. So I'm delighted to introduce Shara Evans. Shara is a futurist, a technologist, and a keynote speaker around the world. Some of you I know have seen her talk before at some big events. So we're very delighted and excited to be able to have her here, all to ourselves at Class, which is very exciting. So Shara is recognised as one of the world's top female futurists. She fuses her engineering background with an intuitive understanding of how society works, and therefore how society is likely to respond to new technologies and new changes. So relevant to all of us, not just the technologists in the virtual room. Shara is also the founder and CEO of Market Clarity, which is an award-winning technology analyst firm and a regular media commentator on technology issues. Some of you might have seen her appear on shows such as Sky News, ABC's Q&A, The Project, Weekend Sunrise, The Drum, Late Line, Weekend Sunrise, I think I said that, 7:30, and many more. Most recently, Shara was a featured commentator on Fox and CW Network's Life 2.0 science documentary series in the USA, which actually was nominated for 3 Emmys earlier this year in July, which is pretty exciting. And in March 2020, Shara was named by Forbes as one of the world's top 50 female futurists, and one of the few technology futurists actually featured in the Forbes list. So we're very lucky to have her. And I'd like you to join me in giving her a very warm Class welcome.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Alexis, for inviting me to join your Ignite Innovation Day. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity. There are so many exciting technologies that it's always hard to choose which ones I'm going to talk about in any given presentation, but I also like to weave in all kinds of current events, and especially the impact that the pandemic will have, but also talk about jobs of the future, because that's what all of us care about. You know, what's going to happen to our careers, to our business, and also to the future of humanity. So some of you are in the breakout room and some of you are virtual. If you're virtual, I'd like you to type in the chat box as I ask questions and ask you for comments, because I think that'll be really interesting to see and have some feedback. And if you're actually sitting in the breakout room, why don't you just grab a piece of paper and write down your thoughts as we go along, because they could be really useful during a Q&A session that we'll have after my presentation. So I'd like to kick off with what I think is going to be the most single important technology that impacts our lives over the coming decades, and that's artificial intelligence. And I'm also going to talk a bit about big data and quantum computing and how that fits into it. But when I talk about AI, I'm using it as a big umbrella because it actually covers a lot of different technologies. And sometimes people think of AI and they think just machine learning or deep learning. Those are some of the techniques that are used in teaching AI. But really what we're talking about is everything from natural language recognition, that whether it be voice or text, we're talking about image recognition, including facial recognition and emotion detection. We're talking about gesture detection. We're talking about smart robots, drones, all kinds of different aspects fall into the realm of AI, and it's going to be woven into almost every kind of technology that you can think of. And it's already in gadgets that you have. It's probably in your computer and you may not know it. It's definitely in your smartphone. And if any of you have bought any recent tech, it's definitely there too. AI is interesting because the fuel for AI is actually big data. And that's where we can run into a little bit of problems, because when you have these massive data sets that may be terabytes or petabytes or even bigger, how can any human possibly know everything that is in those data sets? And the decisions that an AI makes will be based on the data that it's fed. And if you feed it bad data, garbage in, garbage out. So it's really important that data sets are clean and that there are monitoring techniques, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But there's one other aspect that I think is really important to mention, and that's quantum computing. And for a lot of you, you may think, oh my gosh, that's way off in the future. You know, we're decades away from quantum computing. Well, I've got news for you. Earlier this year, Harvard University designed a 256 qubit simulation quantum computer. So it can do simulations. It is capable of doing simulations that have more atoms than there are in our entire solar system. That's going to have major implications for a lot of technologies, and including artificial intelligence. It's going to make it skyrocket. Once we get computers that are super fast, AI is going to grow in leaps and bounds. But on the flip side, when it comes to the kind of security that we have, even blockchain that has really good encryption, when you get that kind of massive computing power, say goodbye to today's encryption. Of course, researchers are working on new techniques, but this is something that you really need to keep an eye on. So one aspect of AI that I'd like to talk about that's a little bit fun is this idea of having home devices like Alexis or maybe Google that are listening, and you talk to it and you get it to do things, which is really convenient. What you may not realize is that it's listening in on everything that's going on in your house. And one of the things that is being predicted is that these AIs that are listening in on conversations are going to start developing techniques where they're going to analyze the pattern of conversations of people in a household or maybe even in a business and start interjecting with suggestions on better ways of communicating with people. So can you imagine you're at home with your partner and your AI digital assistant decides that it's going to interject and say, you know, if you want to have your wife understand you better, John, well, you should really phrase it like this instead of like that. That's a little bit weird. It gets even stranger in the future if you start matching it with genetic engineering and even more advanced AI. Say goodbye to online dating websites. Your digital assistant may be finding you your perfect match somewhere out there in the world too. Now, AI, as I mentioned, it's only as good as the data it has, but it's also susceptible to being manipulated. So one of the big categories for artificial intelligence is image recognition. And when it comes to image recognition, all I have to do to trick an AI into thinking that that school bus up at the top is actually a pyramid or an ostrich is jiggle 1% of the pixels. And to you and I looking at the picture, it'll look exactly like a school bus, but to an AI, it will look like something completely different. And it's actually not a flaw with AI. It has to do with the underlying mathematics of linear functions. And I'm not going to go into the deep math, but I just want you to be aware that image recognition is far from an exact science. So when it comes to AI and big data sets, one of the things that I think is going to be a big new job of the future is an AI trainer. And this is going to be really important because we're feeding it these massive data sets, but we don't know what's in them. And there's also a black box with how AI makes decisions internally. And the output may not be congruent with your company values. It may contain biases, and it may actually have real life consequences. There was an example in the US in the prison parole system where they were looking at the potential for recidivism. And unfortunately, in the data set, there was unconscious bias in the notes that was written about, this is my hypothesis anyway, written about the different people who were up for parole. And it was more lenient to Caucasian men than to people of color. And that's not the sort of thing that we want AI to do. There are so many ethical decisions when it comes to AI. I'll be talking about that a little bit more, but remember, ethics is a huge issue, and reinforcement learning is something that is going to be a huge new job of the future, and it's going to be ongoing because your data sets are going to constantly be changing. Another way that AI is going to learn is when it's in a physical robot. So remember, a robot is just a physical instantiation of artificial intelligence. Now, one of the ways that a company called Kindred AI is teaching AI is allowing people to control a robot through virtual reality and telepresence. So the people controlling the robot have all these VR sensors on, and they're physically showing a robot how to pick up a delicate vase as opposed to picking up something that's made of cloth, and the difference. This is another really big new job category, and it's called imitation learning. And frankly, with all the different kinds of robots that are going to be out there, the sky is the limit in terms of the number of jobs that will be available. And anyone who knows how to do something in the physical world could probably learn to train a robot to do it. But it's also important that we build in empathy and compassion and a human dialogue into these brand new machines that we're building, because if we want machines to give us the best of humanity, we need to teach them to be good citizens. And there are companies like IBM with Watson that are actually employing people like playwrights and philosophers and political scientists who are helping them to write meaningful dialogues so that their AI, as they're, let's say, doing a chatbot or something else, is talking to people in a way that makes sense and is empathetic to the people that they are speaking to. Now, we can't get away from the pandemic. Unfortunately, I wish it was over. I think all of us wish it was totally over. As a futurist, I think we're going to see a lot of twists and turns. I mean, even in the last couple of days, we've seen them. On the news last night, I was watching one of the channels, and they were saying that day trips from Queensland, where I'm in, the Gold Coast, to Sydney are not going to be allowed. You're not going to be allowed back into the border just for a day trip, but anywhere else in New South Wales would be okay. That's, I don't know. I won't comment on politics, but it's going to give us a lot of dramas in the coming years. In Europe, where it's now getting to be cold, they have a massive lockdown in Austria, and they're doing mandatory vaccines. And this is going to become an ongoing drama. In Israel, they're now on the 4th version of their booster vaccines. Unfortunately, I think coronavirus is going to be with us for some time to come. I hope that this is one prediction that I'm dead wrong on, but unfortunately, I think that we're going to see a lot of twists and curves. And one of them, which is already happening and I think is here to stay, is remote work. A lot of you are already remote working. Some of you are back at headquarters, but as the coronavirus ebbs and flows, or there are new variants that come out, well, we could find ourselves going in and out of lockdowns or in and out of working from home in the office. I think we're going to see a situation where people work from home quite a bit of the time, even if we're not in a major pandemic breakout. And that means that we have to have really good security at home. And there are other implications for working from home, such as the lack of the social life that we have when we get together in groups at work. Because frankly, a lot of us get our socialization from working with people, and we enjoy being around people. If we're locked up at home, it's not the same thing. Another thing that is going to be really important and relevant to the pandemic is the supply chain. Many of you would already be aware that you go to a shop and you try to find something that you need on, let's say, your grocery list, and it's out of stock for weeks or months at a time. We need to start manufacturing locally. 3D printing, also known as additive manufacturing, is going to be a big part of it, but we need to start becoming a lot more self-sufficient, especially since Australia is so far away from the rest of the world. And we've already seen examples of where this can work, where we're manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine here, not virus here. And that's because of an agreement between the pharma companies that allow that to happen. I think we're going to see a lot more of this cross-pollination where we're able to do local manufacturing under agreements in various places. Now, one of the really interesting things that has only come about in the last week is developments in nanoscale 3D printing. So to give you an idea, it's a collaboration of universities in Europe and also in Singapore that came up with this. They're using copper, and they have built a nanoscale 3D printer that is able to do 25 nanometer metal. That's 195 copper atoms. To give you perspective, your hair is about 3,000 times thicker than that. Today's metal printing is about 4,000 times bigger than that. Once we start getting to nanoscale 3D printing, we are going to be able to manufacture all kinds of things, and it's not going to be just with metal. Another technology that's going to be really important as we move further and further into the future, it's actually a combination of technologies, augmented reality and virtual reality. And this is an example I like from Spain. They've been doing this for years, well before the pandemic. Acciona Agua, they're a water treatment company, and they use virtual reality for training people on their water treatment system so that they can get together either by themselves and play with things, or with groups of people and do practice exercises and not actually impact the real system. But then they've also deployed augmented reality glasses to their workers in the field that interface with the back-end SCADA system so that they can get real-time reads on what's happening inside a particular pipe. And if they need help with something, they have cameras in these glasses that allow them to talk to specialists who are able to guide them through the things. This is a technology that has so many applications, and I'll talk to you a little bit about where this is going to go in the future, because think about smart contacts, and I'll get back to that, but this has lots of implications for us. Another new technology is in the transportation sector, and that's Hyperloop. I'm showing, in this case, Virgin Hyperloop. There are a number of different companies like HTT, and also SpaceX has its own version. of Hyperloops. Now, these are pipes that literally have all the air sucked out of them so that it's at near vacuum. And by the way, how many of you have heard of Hyperloops? Well, if you haven't, this could be a technology that's the next generation of transport, because once you start taking the vacuum out of a pipe, you can start to get a cruising speed of about 760 kilometers per hour on average, and up to about 11 or 1200, and maybe even higher as a top speed. This test track that I'm showing you is real. And in November of last year, they did a live test. It's only a short track, so they couldn't get very, very fast, only about 173 kilometers per hour, but they did it with live humans. They did it with the Chief Technology Officer and the Chief Customer Experience Officer of Virgin Hyperloop. Imagine if you could get from Sydney to Newcastle in 10 minutes. Imagine if the entire east coast of Australia was covered with Hyperloops that let you get anywhere to anywhere in a very short amount of time. It would change the talent pool of where you can get people from to work for your company, aside from remote working. It would also change where you might put your headquarters. It has such a massive potential. Something else that I have to talk about is sustainability and, of course, climate change and alternative energies. So today, I'm not going to focus on climate change. I want to talk just a moment about alternative energy. So when you think about non-polluting energy, you're probably thinking mainly about solar and wind power. And unfortunately, with those technologies, you need the sun to be shining for solar to be working, unless you have, lots of battery storage, and you need the wind to be blowing to be able to use wind power. But there are a number of new technologies that are coming on the market and being invested in right now that have all kinds of interesting aspects to them. One is green hydrogen. So that is creating hydrogen without emitting any pollutants. And hydrogen is literally made by splitting up oxygen, which is H2O, into hydrogen and oxygen. And that can be used to fuel all sorts of things, including cars. Another interesting technology is something called a wave roller, and there are all kinds of different developments that have been happening around the world for quite some time. But essentially what the wave rollers are doing is harnessing the kinetic energy in waves as they come inland on a shoreline, and being able to store that potentially in a battery, but maybe initially just to power a hydroelectric plant, and have that 24/7, because waves go 24/7. A technology that I find super interesting and particularly relevant to Australia is something called blue energy. How many of you have heard of blue energy? Just type in the chat box, yes, heard of it, no, haven't heard of it. Blue energy is literally harnessing the kinetic energy that happens when a big body of fresh water, like a lake, meets the ocean. And you can harness it with these membranes, usually made out of nano type of materials. The smaller the material, the better. You can capture this energy and store it in a battery, or use it to power a hydroelectric plant. And here we are in Australia, and we are ideally suited for this type of alternative energy. And the best thing about it is the output of this, the only pollutant, is brackish water, which is basically slightly salty water, which of course does not harm the environment. So what about the future of humanity? Are we going to, as humans, take technology into our bodies? Are we going to become part human, part technology, maybe cyborgs? What's on the cards for us humans? Well, I mentioned smart contacts earlier. If you can imagine a contact lens that has all the functions that you have on your smartphone, plus augmented reality, plus biotech. That's the vision for smart contacts. We're not quite there yet, but we're starting to get there in bits and pieces. There are lots of investments, most of them separate, by ICT companies looking to put augmented reality into contact lenses, and also big pharma companies that are looking to do things like being able to test the intraocular pressure in your eyes to test for glaucoma before you develop glaucoma, or do drug delivery based on the contact lenses that are in your eyes, or to analyze the chemicals that are in your tears to determine what kind of disease you might have. And here in Queensland at QUT, they've actually developed what I would call a corneal bandage made out of smart contacts that helps people who've suffered from chemical burns or some other catastrophic eye injury. That's just the start of it. Then we start getting into stem cells. And stem cells have been around for a while, but the main way that we're going to harvest stem cells is from the excess fat on our body. Whoever thought that having a little bit of excess would actually give us lots of benefits? So right now, we are already today using stem cells from people's bodies to do tissue implants made to be biocompatible with their own tissue, or to develop veins or cartilage. There's a scientist in Israel who a couple of years ago invented a little miniature pumping heart. It's a mini human heart that will one day perhaps be an organ transplant of a full-size human heart. Can you imagine the implications of bioprinting, where literally you're using your own stem cells to grow a replacement organ for something in your body that's malfunctioning, and it's completely biocompatible, and it is designed to fit exactly within the cavity of your body? Then we get to nanotechnology. And with nanotech, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we can use nanotech for precision medicine as well. And then there's also genetic engineering, and I'll speak a little bit more about that too. But let's talk about one other aspect, and that's brain-machine interfaces. So here is where we're putting a chip inside of our head that is armed with artificial intelligence. Now, work on this has been underway in research labs for at least a decade, if not more. The initial work was very much focused on helping people with diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia to be able to store their memories and gain access to those memories. In recent years, one of the more famous people who've been investing in this is Elon Musk with his Neuralink company, but he's only one of many. But what they are starting to do in Neuralink is experiment with people who've suffered severe injuries where they've had severed spinal cords, put a chip in their brain and be able to allow them to have access to their bodily functions again and to be able to move their limbs. Can you imagine the amazing benefits that would have for someone who suffered a catastrophic illness? That would be mind-blowing and definitely a positive for humanity. Where it starts to get a little bit sus or a little bit of a problem when it comes to ethics is what happens when you put these chips in your brain to enhance your abilities and maybe give you superhuman powers. Can you imagine if you had a chip in your brain and all you had to do was think a thought and you'd get the answer? Or like the Matrix in Trinity, she needed to learn how to fly a helicopter and you just download it and suddenly you know how to fly a helicopter. Well, that could be cool, but what if somebody hacked it? What are you going to do? Wipe your brain and, do a reset? I don't think so. Another aspect that has to do with ethics is who owns the implant that's in your brain. If it's given to you as an exchange, let's say from a social media company, will that social media company have access to every thought that you have in your brain? Or what if it's your employer? Will they have access to every thought that you have? These chips also have the potential, and it's being worked on by organizations like DARPA in the United States, to be able to control your emotions. The reason that DARPA is interested is for post-traumatic stress disorder for soldiers who are out in the field. But of course, there are lots of other implications. And then there's also this other ethical issue of how does the AI determine between a thought that you want to take an action on versus a fleeting thought. So a really simple example, let's say you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off and you think for a second, somebody ought to ram that so-and-so and teach him or her a lesson. You won't actually really mean to do it, but what if the AI chip decides to act on it? Who's responsible, you or the AI? This is just the beginning of some of the ethical issues that we'll be facing as we start taking these technologies into our body. So I think a chief ethics officer is going to be a really important new job of the future. It's going to be a job for companies. It's the other CEO. I've been quoted as saying that in various magazines, but it will also be part of a government organization as well. And it's going to become increasingly important as we take tech into our body. Another important new job of the future is going to be a privacy guardian, because we are putting out so much data right now. It is just incredible, whether it's on social media or just by email, or by sending information to companies and it's not secured properly. Every day I read of a new data breach and it just scares the heck out of me. We're going to need a new breed of job that's a privacy guardian. And frankly, when it comes to companies collecting data, this is going to be an executive level job that will really have to decide what data do we really need to collect and hold about our clients or people that we do business with. One of the things that's concerning me right now is that I'm actually starting to get requests from people to send copies of my COVID vaccination certificate. And I'm happy to show that I'm vaccinated, but I'm not going to send that to somebody by email because it's got my health identification number and it's got my date of birth. And frankly, with those two pieces of information, my identity can be stolen in a heartbeat. In fact, if you've got your date of birth anywhere on social media, take it off right now. As soon as we finish this conversation, get rid of it. I know it's nice to get birthday greetings, but you do not want to have your identity stolen, because that is the one piece of information that you will never be able to change unless you die. And that's not actually a very good solution. So what does the future of health have in store for us? I've already given you some hints. Well, let's talk a little bit about genetic engineering. With genetic engineering, there's been a lot of work going on in trying to, first of all, mapping out the human genome to figure out what all the genes are, and now trying to figure out what all of these genes do. There are numerous scientists that believe that within the next 10 to 20 years, we are going to find the gene that controls aging. Imagine once we find that gene and we can turn it on or off, we might live to be 400 years old or 800 years old. Can you imagine being married to the same person for 400 years? Love to see your response in the chat box. You might dearly love your partner, but your interests are likely to diverge in 400 years. What about 800 years? Do you really want to work until you're 800? Probably not. And this isn't just science fiction. The Salk Institute a number of years ago was doing some experiments with mice that had a disease called progeria, which is a rapid aging disease. And they were able to reverse the progeria of a middle-aged mouse so that it was actually younger than it started out. So genetic engineering is something that is going to be wild and wacky in the future. But then we also get to nanobots. And nanobots are fascinating because what we're talking about are teeny tiny robots that are so small you need a microscope to see them. There are already experiments that were done with one of the institutes in China and University of Arizona pre-COVID, where they had a nanobot that was designed to detect a particular type of blood cancer by binding with a protein that they found in a cell. And once they found it, they unfurled and then injected a drug which blocked the tumor, the cancer tumor, from receiving any more blood, so that basically it was targeted precision medicine designed to prevent a specific disease. I think the initial rollout of nanobots will be for very specific diseases, different nanobots for different diseases, but eventually we might have nanobots swimming in our body, acting as early warning systems at the first sign of any kind of illness or any kind of organ failure, and proactively start to fix it. Wow, what kind of world would that be? And I'd like to end with one other area that I find super fascinating and is going to generate a huge number of jobs, and that is space travel. Space travel used to be just in the realms of science fiction. Well, guess what? Because of the investments that are being made by private industry with reusable rockets, it's now becoming a reality. And that's the key, reusable rockets. Imagine if you had a jet that went from Sydney to LA and you could only use it one time. The cost to get there would be astronomical. But when you use that jet over and over and over again, the cost gets to where almost anybody can afford to do it. The same sort of thing will eventually happen with space travel. And there are over 1,000 companies that are investing in new modes of space travel. You know, we've got companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and a whole range of others that are planning explorations to nearby planets and other astronomical bodies like the Moon and Mars. Now, if you want to go to outer space, one of the things that you really need is water. And what's super exciting is discoveries that have been made over the last couple of years. In 2015 on Mars, they discovered at the Hale crater that there were salt streaks that appeared from time to time. And then in 2019, they discovered that occasionally there was water vapor in the atmosphere. And in 2020, they discovered that there was what looked like water under the South Solar Pole. And recently on the Moon with the Artemis expedition, they discovered that there was water on the sunlit side of the Moon. So previously it was thought that water was only on the dark side of the Moon. It's not known yet whether that water was there from meteorite impacts or maybe energetic particles from the sun, or maybe it's throughout the Moon. But if we have planetary bodies in our solar system that have water, we have the building blocks for life and we don't have to lug it up. And that bodes really well for the future of space exploration. Someday, in the not too distant future, we're going to start to have colonies either on the Moon and Mars, and there are lots that are planned. They'll probably be initially built by robots using 3D printing techniques and using as the ink for the 3D printers, whatever the native materials are that happen to be on the planetary body that they are exploring. And eventually we humans will get to live in outer space. And someday, probably about 40 to 50 years from now, space tourism may become a reality for mainstream people, not just the super rich. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you would like.